All stories have a beginning. This one starts at the Vancouver airport in December of 2018, when Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou was detained and placed in a BC detention center after an extradition request from the U.S. U.S. prosecutors alleged she committed fraud and lied to a Hong Kong banker so her company could work around U.S. sanctions on Iran. 10 days later, China detained Michael Kovrig, a former diplomat who had previously met with Chinese dissidents, and Michael Spavor, a business consultant who arranged travel into North Korea. China said both men were spies.
This has our attention at the very highest levels of our government.
That attention quickly turned to legal action in both China and Canada. Meng was given an ankle bracelet and confined to her Vancouver mansion while she fought extradition. The two Michaels were imprisoned in China. Canadian officials were given limited access to them. In March of this year, the eyes of the world were on the Chinese courts. Diplomats from the US, Germany, the UK, and Australia stood outside to show support for Spavor and Kovrig, who faced back-to-back espionage trials. 5 months later, Spavor was convicted of spying and sentenced to 11 years plus deportation.
Canada condemns in the strongest possible terms Mr. Spavor's unjust conviction after more than 2.5 years of arbitrary detention.
On his 1,000th day of detention, Spavor's family marched 7,000 steps.
We hoped we wouldn't have to be here, or certainly not in the same situation, but we're here.
Today, it all came to a dramatic end, with Meng headed home to China and the two Michaels en route to Canada.
Well, it's a wonderful day for diplomacy, I have to say, and we needed one. We had some real rough breaks recently with the fall of Afghanistan and Canada's exclusion from AUKUS. So hats off to all those Canadian diplomats that worked so hard for so many years to pull this off. I'd say it's a good day for American diplomacy as well. They got us into this mess in the first place, and it looks like they came through for us in the end and got us out. One thing I think it's really worth underlining is how remarkable it is that after 3 years of Canada standing toe-to-toe with China, that we did not back down on our commitments to the rule of law and our treaty obligations to the United States. I think that defied a lot of expectations, may have upset a lot of people too because of the price that we paid, but it's pretty extraordinary with this huge emerging superpower putting so much pressure on us that we would stick to our guns in the way that we did. Perhaps we could have been more critical on other issues, perhaps we put too much on this one file, but we stood up to the emerging giant in China and protected our national interests.
So you have 3 countries involved here, a major multinational corporation from China, so a lot of moving parts. But let me ask you specifically about this. When it comes to diplomacy, what levers do you think were used either by the United States or Canada to get those 2 Canadians out of imprisonment?
I suspect most of the levers were American in this case. I mean, China is motivated much more by its interests related to the United States than to Canada. And so the levers that we used were probably levers related to our relationship with the United States. China has been facing, as Colin pointed out very rightly, a little while ago, it's been increasingly paying the price for its overly aggressive diplomacy. It's alienated India through some terrible violence at their shared border. It's lost a major trade deal with the European Union because they dared to stand up for the Uyghurs. They now have these nuclear powered submarines going to Australia. And so it may be that China has recognized that it has relied too heavily on hard power, and that without soft power, it actually will lose more than it needs to overseas. So, I mean, we should also give credit where credit is due. That China seems to have made a concession here. Meng Wanzhou admitted to wrongdoing, and that may have been a victory for China's diplomats against the hardliners that seem to have dominated in Beijing for the last many years.
By releasing Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor today, just hours after Meng Wanzhou was allowed to leave the country, it seems to underscore, at least from a Western perspective, that they were being held simply in retaliation. Are you surprised at all by Beijing's timing here?
I am very surprised. I would have thought that China would want to save face by separating in time the release of their national with the release of our nationals. The fact that they did it at the same time suggests, I think, a degree of admission on the part of China that it was tit for tat. But what's really striking here is where China has made a concession. I mean, Meng Wanzhou did actually sign a statement saying that she had done wrong. There was no concession at all on the Canadian side, at least none that we've heard about. And so we do seem to have a situation that is better than I think any of the experts would have expected. That said, I should say there's many other abuses of human rights and abuses of the human rights of Canadian citizens in China. So while this is a good news day, we should spare a thought for Hussein and Khalil, the Canadian citizen who's been in prison for 15 years on trumped up charges of terrorism, Robert Schellenberg, who still faces the death penalty, a penalty that's in contradiction with international human rights norms. And there's many, many other files on which Canada has to continue to fight hard for its interests in China. So all that to say, a good day for Canada, but lots and lots of work for our diplomats to go.
Ben, we have about a minute left. I do want to ask you one last question, and it's a question that I asked Colin Robertson, your fellow former diplomat as well. He used the term hostage diplomacy to describe the imprisonment of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, and then their release today. Do you share that characterization? And if so, what does it say about the risk to Canadians doing business in China going forward?
Very much so. I mean, this was classic hostage diplomacy, tit for tat. Who actually much more than a tit for tat, because our detention of Meng Wanzhou was lawful and consistent with international law, whereas theirs was inconsistent even with their own law. It was a terrible precedent for China to set, and one can only hope that in the view of the fact that it didn't get what they wanted, Meng Wanzhou was not free for these 3 years, and in face of the really large international coalition of countries that came together to condemn China, that they will think hard about practicing such hostage diplomacy a second time.
All right, Ben Rosewell, thank you very much for your analysis.
Pleasure as always.